Like a sour beer. I'm going to go sour.
Yeah.
Really?
No, and do you know why Mark might be right? For the first time in his life.
What?
No, do you know how he might be right?
I
very
would
excited
argue
by
with, I would argue with
very
that, but
excited
I
by
want to
this.
hear.
Whiskey, whiskey, the singer's getting sore. We raised the roof, now we're lowering the floor. The band is blistered, but we got a little more. When I say 1, 2, you say 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. All together gone. It's now or never if you want another song.
All right.
Yeah.
Ready to go?
Yeah, right.
All right, let's go. Welcome to Whiskey Topic. I'm Mark Bylock.
And I'm Jamie Johnson.
And today it's going to be Irish whiskey, which I think is a theme. It's getting close to March, I think.
That's right. Actually.
It's a big,
well
big.
timed. We did that on purpose.
Well, yeah.
Do everything on purpose.
We're so well planned
Nothing
here.
is ever fate.
But we're gonna be talking a lot about Irish whiskey as we do this time of year. I think it was our second or third show, Jamie, that we did an Irish whiskey show.
Yes.
I don't remember what we talked about.
No.
We probably defined what Irish whiskey was.
We probably did, but we should probably do that again at some point.
At some point, yeah,
Yes,
because it's
yes.
changed even. I think the
Yeah.
rules have changed.
Over 100 and, how many? 107 episodes now?
Yeah.
So, my memory.
Yeah, I don't even
it
remember.
escapes
I
me.
mean, I
Yeah.
looked at Wikipedia back then, so I'm kidding. I looked at my book. I always tell people about whiskey tastings. I'm like, so the Wikipedia entry says this.
However.
here's the stuff you can't find on Wikipedia.
That's right.
I mean, really, at these days, like everything's on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
It might not be accurate, but
No, that's why you should go buy yourself a book, specifically The Whiskey Cabinet
Yeah.
by Mark Bylock.
That would be lovely.
Plug.
Plug. I do define Irish whiskey in that book, so I should know the answer. But we have an expert today. We have John Quinn, the global ambassador for Tullamore Dew.
Yay.
Is there a fancy way to say Tullamore Dew?
So it's interesting you asked that question. Now, let me explain that I'm Irish.
Yes.
It might be apparent. And in Ireland, we say Tullamore Dew.
Tullamore Dew.
Dew.
But a lot of people, especially in the US, would say it's Tullamore Dew. And then some people will say Tullamore Dew. And none of them are wrong.
Okay.
I don't care how often people say it, to be honest with you. And whatever way they pronounce it, it's fine. But when I say Tullamore Dew, I have a friend from New York, Alan, and he's a Jewish man, and Alan used to say, Quinn, it's not Tullamore Dew, it's Tullamore Dew. And I said, Alan, that was a very bad New York accent, by the way. I said, Alan, that's the way we pronounce it in Ireland. We can't help it. But there you go.
Well, I like the freedom because in Scotland they make fun of you, and I get made fun of all the time for mispronouncing all the
Mark
all
is
the name.
terrible at pronouncing things, names, like places.
Places,
It's hilarious. You should
whiskey
hear him
names.
try to say Bunnahabhain.
Bunnahabhain.
Bunny.
The
Bunny.
one.
The bunny.
Funny,
whiskey.
I don't even call it Bunnahabhain. I call it Bunnahabhain.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, that's
Because, no, that's the Irish language way of pronouncing. Bunnahabhain literally means, I don't know if you know this, but it literally means the end of the river. Did you know that?
No, I
No.
didn't know that.
Oh, yeah,
We
Awan.
should.
Avan
Yeah.
or Awan is a river, and Bun is the end, so it's the end of the river.
Wow.
Wow.
Oh, there you go.
We
Oh my
have
God,
someone
I
who
have to
can-
start talking about whiskey soon.
Well, and we even have you speak Gaelic, do you not?
I do, yeah.
Whoa.
It's not my fault.
Is that like a prerequisite for Ireland?
No, it's not at all. Like, there's so few people in Ireland who speak it that we don't even we call it Irish, but there's so few people in Ireland who speak it anymore that a bit of a freak, really, but it's grand.
Awesome.
Amazing, because in Ontario, a lot of times we learned Latin. Like a lot of schools still had Latin
Yep.
classes,
Yeah.
which I
That's
thought was
true.
like, well, I guess that's useful.
Yeah,
I don't
not
know.
a lot of people speak that. No.
I remember in school I learned Latin, and one of the boys in school was asked by the teacher why he wasn't keen on it, and he said, it's a dead language. He had a point.
No arguing that at all. No.
dear.
Now, first of all, we'd like to officially thank you as an ambassador for Ireland for inventing whiskey.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
So, John Quinn, thank you so much
You're very welcome.
for
It was
for
our
that.
pleasure.
Yeah. Too many Scots take credit for this, obviously.
Here,
It's,
here.
it's,
Yes.
it's but
The
we're-
uproar that causes when you say in a whiskey tasting that it wasn't the Scots that invented whiskey, you would think.
I
would,
know.
Yeah.
I know.
Oh, it gets ugly. It gets ugly. And also, you did the other favorite thing, which is you brought a lot of cask samples, which, Jamie and I are all about the barrel samples.
Yeah.
This is pretty much the way we like to live. So
yeah.
every day, just
I highly recommend it. Find yourself a brand ambassador who can bring some cask samples.
Yeah,
bring
well,
in
it's
their
also
suitcase.
it's a great thing for a brand ambassador to do because you get an opportunity to explain to people who might be in the industry but don't know enough, or sorry, maybe know it enough to sell it, either across the counter or into bars, but they really need to get to know it a bit better to feel even more confident. So when I did this talk to the sales team in Toronto, I presented these cask samples and they said, it makes so much more sense.
It really does make a difference when you get into the nitty gritty of it. And it doesn't mean you have to understand the bits and pieces of distillation or the acidity level. And like, you don't have to really understand, but to break it down and to do that deconstruction, it gives you such an appreciation of how minute some of these flavors are and how it all comes together. So I think anyone could appreciate this sort of thing.
Yeah, it certainly it rings the bells. And I did a bit of bartender training yesterday as well, and the guys loved it. They really said, okay, this is getting under the skin of it. I get it now. It's much more intelligible to me. So that's grand. I like that.
That's great. Yeah. That's great. Well, we're looking forward to going through that. But how about you tell us a little bit about how you got into this in the first place?
Oh, God, it's a long story. I'm glad you're sitting down.
And we have whiskey, so just go right ahead. Take your time.
I actually started in the whiskey business, in the Irish whiskey business, in 1974. Okay, not 1874, despite the face, okay? And how did I get into it? Well, it's not really a sexy story, I'm sorry to tell you, but I was playing football for a team, and the team's manager said to me, what are you going to do when you finish school? Are you going to go onto university? Or are you going to? I said, I'm not really sure. And he said, look, my brother is looking to recruit some people in a company that sells whiskey. It's called the Irish Distillers Group, whatever. And they're looking for young guys to start their careers. And so I went for an interview, and I was given the job as the office boy. And I started, that's how I started.
That's amazing.
No, it's not amazing. It's really boring.
No,
there's nothing
it's
sexy
a
about that
twist
at
of
all.
fate. No.
But this was the 70s. Like the photocopier hasn't existed yet. The fax machine didn't exist. I mean, what did the office boy do at
You're
that
right.
point?
The fax machine didn't exist. The office boy opened the post and he delivered it around to the various different people and whatever. And to be honest with you, actually, this is actually kind of annoying. But before I started, they rang me and said, we've just promoted you. So I hadn't even started. And I said, seriously? Okay. They said, we want you to work at the bottling plant and to be the sort of recorder of bottling statistics or whatever. And it's a promotion and you're going to get more money.
Wow.
That's a grand.
70s were great.
Yeah,
Great
no,
time.
exactly. Yeah.
I don't think that happens.
No, I was really able though. They could say I was a really able guy. So they gave me a promotion before
like a stand-up
before
guy,
they
John.
even met me kind of thing, So that was a time that was really significant. And I was so young, I didn't understand the significance of it. And I used to walk down into the distillery and into the cooperage in John's Lane in Dublin, which was the Powers distillery. And I didn't appreciate the history that I was surrounded by and the smells and the noises, the cooper shouting and everybody making noise. And it was great.
Awesome.
But I didn't get it. I didn't understand that this is a history in the making because we're closing it soon, I had no appreciation.
Wow.
It was afterwards, that I look back and say, oh, God, that was a great time to be down there, So I was lucky. I worked in the distillery in John's Lane when it was still a working distillery, and then it closed that year.
So you worked through the closing and then moved to Middleton.
In fact, I was a little bit involved in moving of casks from Dublin to Middleton. I was involved in a team called the Middleton Project. Again, I was junior, so it was 75, 76, and they asked me to get involved in the movement of casks from the distilleries in Dublin down into the Middleton warehouses. So.
That's amazing. I mean, like, you think about the Irish whiskey, how big it is today, and now we've got like 30 plus distilleries in Ireland. And back then, that was it. There was 2 distilleries holding up the fort, and three distillers came together and said, okay, we're picking a home, and we're going to move here. And that's the only way we can keep going.
So that was the point. I mean, the distilleries in Dublin, in the Powers distillery, which was distilling Tullamore Dew at that time as well, the Jameson distillery, even the Cork Distillers distillery, which is the Paddy Whiskey distillery in Cork, they were all too small. And the ones in Dublin were city bound. So in order to expand, they needed a greenfield space.
Okay.
And because all the companies had come together, all the companies came together in the 60s, the Powers with Tullamore Dew in that family, the Jamesons and the Murphys from Cork, the Cork Distillers Company, they all came together to form one company in 1966, which was to be the United Distillers of Ireland, soon to be changed to Irish Distillers Limited. And in 1972, the Bushmills Company joined that group. And that became the Irish Distillers Group in 72 that I joined in 74. So it was really a newly formed company at that time.
Wow, that's amazing. And owned by a few different people throughout the time. I guess you have 2 different companies.
So in my time, it was it was a publicly quoted company, Irish Distillers Group. After I left that company, it became owned by Pernod Ricard. Yeah, that was 89, I think, So
And
then
the Grant's family came in and they're like, "Well, we're buying this."
yeah, so the brand actually was bought by a company called C&C in Ireland. It was C&C International was another company, and then I was with C&C International, and then the brand was bought by the William Grant's Group in 2010. So some people say to me, "When did you join the William Grant's Group?" I say, "I didn't. They joined me." You know, because I've been there down the years, so it's a bit of a joke, obviously. But I've been very lucky because it's a great business to be in. And now it's an even greater business to be in, you know. So I was there when, I suppose you could say, people say, "Oh, you were there in the tough times." I didn't know they were tough.
Right.
But you know,
That's-
I mean,
that was
now I
where
look
it
back and
started.
say, yeah, of course, yeah.
And this is the number 2 selling whiskey in the world.
Yeah.
Irish whiskey in the
Irish
world.
whiskey in the world is
Yeah.
number 2. Yeah. And we're very proud of that. And I'm personally delighted that I've been part of that story. That's great. And it's not that we constantly measure how well we're doing, although we do. But it's you know, if you're in the whiskey business, it's just not always about numbers. It's more about emotions, feelings, creativity, looking at the past and enjoying the past and looking to the future and seeing what that might hold. And yes, you have to add up the numbers. As I sometimes say to people, if we didn't sell as much Tullamore Dew as we do, 4 expensive kids wouldn't have gone to college.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, and thanks be to God they did. You know, so.
Are any of them interested in the whiskey business?
Well, actually, imagine one of my children, my daughter, lives in Chicago and works for a well-known American bourbon company called Jim Beam.
Ah.
So she works for them. She's in a marketing role there, and she's doing really well, and she's very happy there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I love it.
I'm not supposed to talk about other whiskey companies.
Yeah,
that's
you
not-
No.
absolutely- yep,
Did I mention?
absolutely
Did I
can.
even mention the company I work for yet?
Well, you mentioned how to pronounce it. I believe that's as far
Oh,
as
yeah,
we
that's
got.
true. That's a fair point. That's a fair point. I gave you a license to pronounce it any way you want, Mark.
I did, which is amazing. This is more than I've ever gotten from Scotland. Thanks, Scotland.
Good.
And now there is a distillery by this name.
Yeah, the Tullamore Distillery is now up and running since 2014. We did have an old distillery until 1954.
Okay.
And then with the closures of many distilleries in Ireland around that time, through the 40s, 50s, and indeed many of them had closed long before the Tullamore Dew distillery, that closed. And then we were being produced, our whiskies being made for us under license in Powers and then under license in Middleton. So, and that's been happening since then. Like many of the Irish whiskey brands, their own distilleries closed, and the Middleton distillery, we would have called it the Middleton Distilleries Complex, because a few distilleries within it. And so Middleton produces for many of the brands of Irish whiskey, and now Tullamore has its own distillery again since 2014, which is great.
Oh.
Well, I think it's time to have a little sip.
Yeah,
It's
grand.
been, a whole
Grand.
5 minutes.
Right?
So what I was doing with the other guys the other day, and what I purport that we should do, or propose we should do now,
Yes.
is when we talk about Tullamore Dew, one of the things I'm trying to explain to my audiences, who are usually professionals or people who understand whiskey in any case, is that within the Tullamore Dew blend, there are 3 styles of whiskey. So we have grain whiskey, made from patent stills, continuous distillation, you understand that. Or we have malt whiskey, which is a single malt, and we have pot still whiskey, which is a single pot still. And therefore, when I'm explaining to people, I say, let's try the grain whiskey, let's try the malt whiskey, let's try the pot still whiskey, and let's understand the key differences between all 3 in terms of flavor profile, also in terms of production process, and even mash bills and things like that. And then people get to understand, okay, it tastes like that because of that.
Yeah.
And that one tastes like, and then the blend of all 3 together tastes like that because they have all those different blends.
This
So
is the deconstruction of
this
the
is the
This is
deconstruction of whiskey,
perfect.
exactly
This
right.
is great.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I sometimes call it the beauty of blending session.
Oh, it's wonderful that you use that word blend, because I think there's still people get all persnickety about when you say blend, and I think we've been trying to, at least on the podcast, say the word blend doesn't mean
Yes.
it's not a
Bad
bad
thing.
thing. All of whiskeys are blended unless you have a single barrel. Like that's it. That's everything else has been married together.
Yes.
But that's just a fancy word for blending.
That's
blended.
right.
It's all blended.
Yeah. And I sometimes say to people, look, our head distillers are very important. Your master distiller is an extremely important person, man or woman. Your master blender is probably even more important. I'd sometimes describe the malt whiskies and the pot still whiskies as the ones that really give a lot of flavor. There's flavor here, absolutely there's flavor here. It's a sweet whiskey, it's a very approachable whiskey, and indeed when I've done these deconstruction tastings with people who've done it for the first time and say, "Oh, that's really nice. I would buy that." Well, you can't. It's not for sale.
Not for sale. So enjoy it now.
It's only for little geeky sessions like we're having at the moment. So that's, I mean, I sometimes describe it as having a kind of a biscuit sweetness. There's a biscuit that you can get in Ireland called Nice biscuits, N-I-S-E, or N-I-C-E, and people think that's nice.
Nice.
It is nice, but
They
it's
are nice.
they're called Nice biscuits. And they're kind of sugary, sweet biscuits, and it's kind of in that direction. So trying to give
Breadiness of
people,
it, yeah.
trying to give
Butteriness.
people a flavor direction on it, I would say it's quite sweet, but vanilla sweet, I think. Yeah.
Would
I'm gonna
you
taste it one more time just to be sure.
Yeah. Would you mature each of these separately and then blend
Yes.
at the end?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So this has been matured in an ex-bourbon barrel.
Okay.
So we will use in different, depending on the spirit type, whether it's grain whiskey or malt whiskey or pot still whiskey. We'll use either ex-bourbon or ex-sherry.
Okay.
But the ex-sherry we only use for our pot still maturation.
Okay.
We don't actually mature the grain or the malt in sherry cask. Okay, for this blend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Good to know.
So that's the first one. And I often say to people, I hope you didn't finish all of that. And they say, oh, too late, so it's
Too
okay, we have
late.
more.
Yeah.
There's a lot more.
But if you didn't finish off it, I would say to the guys, keep some of that because I want you to compare with the other whiskeys. So the second one beside that is the single malt. Okay. Again,
Yep. Fruity, like
fruity.
like
Ooh, yeah.
right
Yeah.
off the
No,
nose.
exactly, Jamie. And that's what I say to people. It's so fruity. It's like juicy fruit. Did you ever taste juicy fruit?
Yeah,
That
it
chewing
is.
gum, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's like
Yeah.
so juicy fruit.
Oh my gosh.
It's fabulous. Now, and I say this to people, all malt whiskies would be fruity, except that sometimes we're going to use peat to dry the barley, and then once you impart the peat through the drying process, you're never going to get that back. You're never going to take out the peat at any stage, so it's always going to be there. And it's just hard to pick out the fruit sometimes through the peat, and certainly you wouldn't get this level of fruit.
Wow. Yeah, it's a whole other level. It is a
Yeah,
whole other
it
level
is.
of fruitiness.
It's like-
Wow.
There's all kinds of berry fruit in there, and
yeah.
I keep saying it. I should shut up about it. Actually, it's juicy fruit.
It
It's
is
juicy
juicy
fruit,
fruit. It is-
Starburst, all
yes.
of those things.
Starburst. That's the
Yes.
candy I was thinking of.
Yeah,
Starburst.
Starburst, yeah.
Starburst is
Yeah, yeah,
definitely
yeah.
the one that hits it on the head for me.
Yeah, and that's about 63. I think 63%. Yeah, so it's 63.2%. Yeah. Again, I always add a little water just for the purposes of tasting.
So this is much drier. I mean, the nose is fruity. On the palate, it's drier.
It's drier.
Get more that.
It's drier on the palate,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's,
fair.
and we have to say that the casks are going to help that along in terms of helping the dryness come along. Yeah, and it's a pleasant combination of the two.
Yeah.
Really, really happy with it. Well, I love that whiskey, and
So this is column distilled as well.
no, it's
this,
pot
This
distilled.
is pot distilled.
Pot distilled. Yeah, all of our malt whiskies are distilled through pot distilled system. Yeah. I mean, so. We'll talk about the pot still whiskey in a moment, but sometimes when I talk about pot still whiskey and I talk about malt whiskey, a lot of my audiences are going to presume that malt whiskey is not in a pot still because I've talked about pot still whiskey coming through, and that's the shape of the still.
Right.
So they presume it's not actually in.
Right.
Actually, no, it's also distilled in a pot still.
That's right, because we haven't talked about the definition of Irish whiskey, but I guess we can with the next drink.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
yeah.
but if we're going to go talk now in a moment about the pot still whiskey, so what I would say to people is, malt whiskey is when it's 100% malted barley and it's from a single distillery, so it's single malt, and if it's not 100% malted barley, we can't call it a malt whiskey.
Yeah.
So we go to pot still whiskey. We're using a variation of 50-50 malted and unmalted, so raw barley, or sometimes 60-40 or 40-60, depending, and that's pot still whiskey. And then somebody says to me, well, why do you pot still whiskey in the first place? Well, actually, there's a story about that, and the reason is that the tax laws of the late 1700s, 1775, I believe was the year, there was a tax law introduced called the malt tax. And so the guys in Ireland realised that if they used less malt, they'd pay less taxes. And we weren't famous for wanting to pay taxes to the English king, in fairness. And so, because, we always talk about the English, they came to Ireland, you know that.
Yep.
They weren't invited, but they came anyway. And so, therefore, we found ourselves paying taxes that we weren't happy about. Now, by the way, I'm old, but even I wasn't around in the 1770s. But, so then the development of the pot still whiskey concept was based on using less malt, paying less tax, and then it became sort of the quintessential Irish style of whiskey. Pot still whiskey, yeah.
And they did the same thing. Scottish distillers did the same thing. They also did the kind of malted unmalted at that era, but they kind of went back to.
They just drifted back to the single malt, and then the other thing that happened, of course, is grain whiskey.
Yeah.
Oh, we didn't even talk about grain whiskey.
No.
I don't know if your visitors or your listeners know.
No, you should.
So
mention
grain
this.
whiskey was an invention of an Irishman. Actually, we claim we invented everything,
Wow.
including the submarine. Anyway, so
The submarine.
I know, don't go there. Anyway, but the idea of continuous distillation was something that a guy called Coffey invented. You've heard of him?
Yep.
The
Yes.
Coffey still. Now, sometimes we talk about his first name, and sometimes we don't, because his first name is Anus.
That's why.
Even in Irish, with an Irish accent, does not sound.
No, it doesn't sound right. Sure doesn't.
No.
Now, I suppose if it were to be, no, you're not good at pronunciation, Mark. But,
No.
So I can say is probably Aeneas would be correct.
Okay.
There's no fun in that, so we just call him Anus. Anyway, Anus Coffey. Will this be edited? Anyway,
Not
so-
that part. No, that's hilarious.
Anus Coffey actually was he was actually a taxman, a customs and excise official, and he was based in Donegal, which is in the northwest of Ireland. And his role really was to seek out and find the illegal distilleries. You know, there's I don't want to sing, but there's a song, an Irish ballad, and it goes like this. Oh God, I'm gonna sing.
You're
no,
gonna sing.
this is
You're gonna
awful.
sing. It's
Yay.
great.
This is only-
Jamie
I'm
likes
sorry
this.
I did this. Okay, so it goes like, gather up the pots and the old tin cans, the mash, the corn, the barley and the bran, run like the devil from the excise man to the hills of Connemara. Okay, so now you know I don't sing, but that song was to epitomise exactly what the Irish distilling industry was going through. A lot of the distilleries were mobile.
Yeah.
And when the authorities were on their way, they picked them up, they gathered them up, and they ran to the hills of Connemara, whatever. So
This is where the Bush administration got that mobile thing when they wanted to invade Iraq. Gotcha. Mobile.
these
You're
days,
right, the
I'm
Irish
not
did invent-
discussing American politics.
Yeah,
I
I
can
know.
You're right. The Irish did invent everything.
Yeah, so that point was that to move or to have mobile distilleries meant that they needed gougers, they called them, or gaugers. And these
Gougers.
are the guys who went around and found the distilleries that were illegal, reported them to the police, and the police then came, took the equipment away, or charged, or fined them, or both. And Anus Coffey was one of those guys. Yeah, and then he gave it up because he actually was stabbed. He got beaten up by a few people. You can imagine he wasn't that popular in the local town.
No.
No.
So he was beaten up and he got stabbed. The records say he was stabbed in the leg. I don't know why anyone would stab him in the leg, but he was. So maybe to stop him running, I don't know. So anyway, he gave it up and took on this idea that there was a guy called Steen, a Scotsman, who had this continuous distillation idea, and he took Steen's idea and commercialized it, made it work. And it's forever known as the coffee still. You'd have
That's
known it as
correct.
the coffee still, and
Yep.
that's where it came from. And he brought it to the distillers of Ireland. I am going on too long.
I
here.
know
Will
this
I
is.
stop?
I'm
I know,
fascinated.
all
I'm
of it.
so fascinated.
Sometimes I
great.
talk too much. So he brought the idea to the distillers of Ireland, and they said, that doesn't taste like whiskey the way we know it. We don't want it. You're grand. Thanks very much. He brought it to the distillers in Scotland, and as I often say, the Scots said, is it cheaper to make? We'll have it. Thanks very much. So then the Scots embraced continuous distillation and decide, I'd really like it to be a bit sweeter, so you're going to use more grain. I'd like it to be more fruity, you'll use more malt. I'd like it to be more spicy, you're going to use pot still. And so I'm going to create a little blend here.
All
in
right.
my glass.
I think we're going to need those bottles.
This is not the first time I've done this, by the way. And it's just a bit of fun, and that's what I say to all the guys.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be fun.
Just create your own blend, and then when you've done that, we'll compare it with the Tullamore Dew blend.
Okay.
Oh,
And then
nice.
we were able to see what's the difference. And as I've often said to people, if
like
your
a little
blend is really good, Jamie,
Yes.
we're going to stop selling Tullamore Dew. We're going to launch the Jamie Johnson
Oh, man, I'm gonna be
blend of Irish
famous.
whiskey. That's the only lie I'll tell you today.
I'm gonna I'm gonna be so famous, you guys. So I put mostly the pot still whiskey.
Okay.
I just want a hint of sweetness,
Okay.
and then I'm gonna put a little bit more of.
Okay.
I'm just doing this blind.
So there.
who knows?
So
Maybe
then,
I'm a genius.
So then, what you're going to have is you're going to have quite a spicy whiskey.
Yes.
So fine.
Exactly.
Good for you. Good
Ooh,
for you.
I like what I did. I think it's very similar to what, mostly spicy.
Yes.
Yeah. Not a surprise.
We have
Jamie.
a very similar
Yeah.
palates, so we tend to towards the same whiskeys. I'm not surprised at that.
Yeah. And because I've added water to mine, I've taken them down from the cask strengths of 60, 70%, and I've brought it down to about 40. So then I can compare with the Tullamore Dew then. And that's what I will always do with the teams then, that I'm talking to the bartenders. I explain, okay, let's compare your blend with the Tullamore Dew blend, and let's see if we're finding a difference and why that might be.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I did a great job. I think I'm going to give myself an A+ on that one. I might be a master blender. Who knows?
Who knows?
Who knows what the next step in my career is going to be? But I think it's going to be master blender.
Yeah, I think so.
It only takes 8 years to be a match blender. That's all it takes.
That's all.
Almost as long
Lucky
as
for you have time in your hands.
I was gonna
And your time on your side.
Yeah.
Something I don't have. So then
is
I'll get people to, maybe we'll compare your blend with the Tullamore Dew blend and see what we think is the difference. Yeah. So the difference between the blend that you've created and the Tullamore Dew blend, the one difference will be, apart from the obvious difference of whatever proportions, the one difference is within the Tullamore Dew blend is we also have some of our pot still whiskey maturing in sherry casks. Yeah, so this is a bourbon cask matured pot still that we have here. We also got some sherry cask, and then that will create a difference between what you've had, let's say, and what you use with Tullamore Dew. And that's unusual, actually. Not in Ireland, but is unusual to have a blended whiskey where sherry casks are used in the maturation. Yeah,
absolutely.
That's in Scotland and other places. Sherry casks will really only be used for the single malts.
Yes.
Either for maturing or finishing or both. And in our blend and other Irish whiskey blends, we would use some sherry cask in the development of them.
Gives it that nice little extra character.
Just
a little bit of
extra. Gives it a little bit of nuttiness.
Roundness, absolutely. And those lovely baking spices.
Sometimes talk about the marzipan kind of a touch to the end of it, and that's sort of coming through from the sherry cask. It tends to give us that.
I like
Obviously
the spiciness, and that still comes through. The citrusiness really kind of crushes down really nicely.
And like so. If I wasn't doing a deconstruction and people ask me about Tullamore Dew, I'd say it's quite a sweet whiskey. And a lot of the Irish whiskies are kind of sweet in their flavour notes. And it's also a fruity whiskey, but it's also got a little bit of spice. And so that's without them ever getting the chance to taste the three. Yeah. But I can validate it when I'm doing this, because people can taste, there's the sweetness, it's coming from the grain. There's the fruit, it's obviously fruity coming from the malt. And there's the spices from the pot still. And when you put them all three together, it explains the taste profile because we're actually getting to the very basics of the whiskey making and the blending that we're doing there. Yeah.
No, and this is great because I think some people think that Irish whiskey, because single malts and Scotch have been so big, and they sort of assume that Irish whiskey is the Irish version of a Scotch. But doing this sort of breakdown, there's some super fundamental differences between production.
Absolutely. And in Scotland, you're not going to have a blend that has pot still whiskey in it.
Right.
Even some of the Irish blends don't have pot still whiskey in it.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Some of the Irish blends don't have malt whiskey in it. I mean, I guess that's one of the things I'm most proud of. That sounds awful. But that's one of the things I like about talking about is that of the three styles of whiskey made in Ireland, Tullamore Dew has all three styles in it.
Right.
Not all of the whiskies are triple blends. In fact, to be fair, Tullamore is the only whiskey in the world that is a triple distilled version of all three styles of Irish whiskey using three different cask styles: ex-bourbon, refill Irish, and ex-sherry. So there's no other whiskey in the world does that.
Yep.
Does it make it the best whiskey in the world? We'd never say that. Of course it does. But no, we never say, no whiskey claims to be the best whiskey in the world. But it just makes it a little bit complex, a bit interesting from that point of view. And that's what I love talking about it. In case you hadn't noticed.
No, and let's go one step back. Just so we didn't define pot still. I mean, we did kind of, but that was a recent definition in the last several years. Before it was more. Pot still didn't necessarily have a legal definition. Is that right?
I think back in the 1980 there was an Irish Whiskey Act in 1980, and that gave some semblance of definition to it. There's a bit of focus on, particularly with the development of new distilleries. There's a bit of focus in terms of trying to get definitions very clearly made, and now there is an Irish Whiskey technical file, what we call a technical file, which we've developed as an Irish Whiskey Association, and we developed it in order that within Europe and in other countries we could get a GI, a geographical indication. So therefore, if you want to be called an Irish whiskey, it has to be within the following definition. So it's quite quite a few pages of definition. So I'm not going to
lawyers get involved.
Get
I
the
promise
PDF
I'm not going to go through it all.
circulating,
But
yep.
I mean, to be an Irish whiskey, you've got to be distilled and matured on the island of Ireland. That's the first thing. And then if you're getting into different types of whiskies, the blended Irish whiskey is defined. Irish single grain, Irish single malt, and Irish single pot still. They're all defined in the way that they're defined. But there is some latitude, for example, in terms of pot still whiskey. Is it 50-50? Is it 40-60, 60-40? So there's latitude there, as long as the mash bill is a combination of raw barley and malted barley. And that's essentially the difference, really.
And I guess the question to ask, why use malted and malted barley? What's the what
Yeah,
reason?
so it goes back to a tradition, obviously,
It's
the
traditional.
traditional time. It became, especially among the Dublin distillers, it became the quintessential whiskey from the Dublin distillers. So John Powers was the biggest distillery in Dublin at one time. Well, actually, not to be fair, that's not true. There were huge, William Jameson had a distillery, George Rowe had a distillery, John Power had a distillery, John Jameson had a distillery. They were all big Dublin distilleries. And they made pot still whiskey. If you think about those distilleries, were all built in the late 1700s, early 1800s, just after the malt tax, let's say. Also, those distilleries were all built in a part of Dublin, which is known as the Liberties area, and that was very close to Dublin Castle, which housed the Customs and Excise Authorities people. So they weren't inclined to make single malts on which they had to pay full tax.
Yeah.
So they made pot still. And now in the rural distillers, a lot of them would have made single malt and single pot still, and they might have claimed it was all pot still.
Right.
So they paid slightly less tax, but they could sort of get away with it because they were further away from the authorities.
And I mean, unmalted barley takes longer to ferment, I believe. Is that correct? Like
Yeah, so
it's a longer
well,
process.
it's a little bit more difficult to work with.
Yeah.
And so first of all, it's a harder grain than the malted barley, so it takes in the milling, it's a little bit more difficult. And but in our case, the fermentation is going to take 72 hours, which is 3 days, which is a little bit longer than many. Yeah, we often talk about the power of three. Triple distilled, triple blend, triple cask matured, brilliant. And then I say, and 3 days to
3
ferment.
days to
So
And you can't stress the how important that fermentation process is for the whiskey that you make.
you cannot overstress. You're absolutely right, because you get a huge amount of the flavors and the esters that we talk about coming through from the fermentation process. And you have to be careful with fermentation that you don't leave it too long and doesn't sour, etc., etc. You have to be very careful with that, and it's a pretty exact science for the guys at the distillery.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, also it's really great to have cask strength whiskey here, because I think not all distilleries make great cask strength whiskey, but they'll mature the bad stuff out of it and finish it and everything else. So like to come in and bring, I think it's very confident. I always say that if Belvini does the same thing. If you bottle or you bring a single barrel product, if you bring samples of the cask strength, it's usually a good sign of confidence.
No, we're very confident in it. I mean, these are not that old. These are 2013, so they're 5 years old. Each of these, they're not that old. 5 coming up.
Yeah, there's
5
nowhere
years
to
old.
hide.
Yeah, there's
nowhere
that's
to
right.
hide with these.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And
If you're not making a good
luckily,
spirit,
luckily I have access to this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Right. But I never do this with consumers, in the sense that I'm reluctant to call them ordinary people, but people on the street are not, it's too geeky. It's too far for them. But people who are interested in whiskey, it's very interesting, and particularly people whose business is whiskey, like sales teams or bartenders or owners of restaurants, whatever. If whiskey is their livelihood, then the more information they get, the better they are. And these days, right, you'll know this, everybody is interested in the provenance and how things are made, where it's from, what makes it different, etc. So it's very important to be able to do this.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I think we see this with the bourbon craze. People are asking mash bills, barrels, where that barrel's been in the warehouse, how long this the amount of questions people ask at this point is so. And certainly companies like Jim Beam and this and that bring a lot of great samples and single barrel products. So I think having this is going to be.
Well, I suppose it's what I do in one sense. As people say, what do you do for a living? I talk, and I drink whiskey, but it's educational. I'm an advocate, obviously, but I have to be an educator, and luckily. People these days want to be educated, which is great. Yeah, you know that. You know that from your own podcast. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah,
It's about
they want to
education.
know.
Yeah.
They want to know where it comes from. They want to know how it's made. They want to know everything. They'll
Yeah.
ask you what kind of yeast you're using.
Yeah, that's a good point. When we
Yeah.
started this 3 years ago, I'm like, are we talking too much about whiskey?
Yeah.
Too geeky about
Too
it? And
geeky,
then
but
no,
no.
people just
Yeah.
that's it. That's what people want to hear. It's just yeah.
Absolutely.
The other thing that people say to ask me, say, "Oh, so what is Tullamore? Where does it get its name?" And I say, well, it's the town in Ireland between Dublin and Galway. If you ever go, Dublin's on the east coast, Galway's on the west. It's right in the heart of Ireland. Now, the emotional heart of Ireland, of course, I'm going to say that's the marketing budget. But it's it's right in the centre of Ireland. And the other thing that I often say to people is Tullamore is an anglicised version of an old Irish name. Because Tullamore used to be on Tullamore. And on Tullamore is the Irish language for the big hill. So, townspeople would have settled on rivers or coastland or coastal areas or hills, as in the case with Tullamore. So it's the land of the big hill, and it used to be known as on Tullamore. But when we learned the English language after they came over, which thanks be to God they did, it became, on Tullamore became Tullamore. And like Dovling became Dublin.
Yeah.
Dovling actually translates into Blackpool. So that's amazing, you know what I mean? Because when the people arrived, this was dirty river that they regarded as the Blackpool became known as Dovling, and that became anglicised into Dublin. So all the Irish place names were once in the Irish language had a different name and meaning, and they just became anglicised. Ishkabah, what did that become anglicised to?
Whiskey.
Correct. So, oh my God, we gave them everything.
That's it. This is
Everything. That's it.
there's nothing else to
There's
learn.
nothing else to give. There we go.
No, there's really good about Scotch whiskey. Can we talk about Scotch whiskey?
Yes,
that's-
of course we can.
Let's
So
change
there's
that.
I don't know if you've ever come across Charlie McLean. Charlie
I
McLean.
actually had I went to his house and did a big tasting with him.
You
I
did.
did.
What a great
Me
guy.
and
What a
Charlie,
great man.
Yes.
Charlie is great. He's nearly my age. He's very old. But Charlie is a great guy. But he has a wonderful piece on YouTube about the arrival of whiskey into Scotland from Ireland. And he talks about Fergus MacVeigh or Fergus Beaton, who was a medicinal man from Ireland who brought distilling to the island of Islay. And there's a cross in the island of Islay. In Kilcoman, actually, there's a cross giving him credit for having been the man who brought whiskey. It's obviously where he's buried. But
Wow.
And Charlie McLean, who is one of the great Scotch whiskey historians, absolutely, and he will say that. So when people say, come on, you didn't invent whiskey, the Scots invented it, I say, well, ask Charlie McLean then.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I don't think anybody knows who invented whiskey in the sense that Ishkabah, the water of life,
Yeah.
Axavita, you know what I mean? Who knows? But we're taking the credit.
I say go for it.
Should we ask the question? What's the oldest distillery in the world?
Ooh, what is the oldest
So
distillery in the
I can
world?
tell you that the oldest distillery in the world, according to my daughter, is the Kilbeggan distillery, she says.
See?
Interesting.
This is a controversial topic.
This is a very controversial because
Why?
we've heard Bushmills as
But
the
I can,
oldest
I can tell you why.
licensed-
Yeah, I can tell you why. Bushmills in 1608 was given, the area around there was given a license to distill. But unfortunately, the distillery wasn't built until late 1700s.
There you go.
I know things. This is
Yeah.
amazing.
See?
This will
Yeah.
make sense if you listen to the previous podcast.
Yeah.
A little bit more
Okay.
than.
Yep.
And did somebody else say Kilbeggan, or am I the only one?
No,
No
we
one
had
has
no
said
idea.
no,
No, you were
no.
the first to say.
You're the
Okay,
first to say
so
Kilbeggan.
I think Kilbeggan was 1757. I think. No, God forgive me if I don't know this because I'll be killed at home. But I think so. I think it was. Yeah. Here I am talking about my
There you go.
competitors' whiskies.
It's all
which
right.
I'm very
I
happy
do-
to.
It's, of
Yeah.
course.
No, when you're
We
old,
do
you're
it all
supposed
the
to know
time.
stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow.
Well, you also brought something else with you that
Yeah.
we're pretty excited to
Yeah.
try, something new. Tell us a
Yeah,
little
so
bit about
we've
it.
just launched a new variant of Tullamore Dew. It's called Tullamore Dew XO. And it's essentially the Tullamore Dew blend that we've already just tasted. And for a little over 3 months, we have finished it in casks that previously held a rum from Guyana. Yeah,
Amazing.
it's from the Demerara distillery in Guyana.
It's nice that some distillers reveal where their rum
yeah,
comes from,
so
Jamie.
this is Demerara.
That is a total dig at me in the Balvenie right now.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yes.
Because
Well, this
Balvenie's
is-
so big, they're like, we get it from everywhere. Come on, guys. There's
You know
not
what? I'm just thinking, was I supposed to tell you that? Okay, let's keep it between us three, all right? So, the Demerara distillery makes a
We
rum
did tell
called
John we
Demerara
don't
rum.
edit this podcast at all, right? There's no editing whatsoever.
And when rum has been aged in Guyana, it's known, in many places, known as XO rum. So this is why it's called Tullamore Dew XO. So, and let's have a taste of it, because my father used to say, could we have less of the lark and more of the swallow. And what he really meant was, would stop talking.
Stop
and let's
talking
have a
and start
drink.
drinking.
Well,
That's right.
and this is mine here.
Well, I'll
So-
tell you something. Rum cask finishes are some of my faves.
Oh, that's the one I've been drinking. Oh,
Yeah.
I need
You've
a
been
little bit more,
drinking it
please.
already. Mark just worked his way ahead.
Well done, Mark.
I thought that was the extra pre-drinking pour. I didn't realize the post-drinking pour. That wasn't.
Pre-drinking pour. That's
That was
nice.
like an appetizer. Or something.
That's
Because
great.
sometimes it takes 20 minutes for the first drink. So I
Well,
thought,
I'm there. Well, so
Jamie,
since
you're
you
always
had
very good about
since
that.
you had a preview, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. Well, so I'm a huge fan of rum cast finish. If anyone knows the story of me sort of getting into single malts, and I don't even tell this because I work for the Balvenie now.
Yeah.
It's a true story that Mark suggested the Balvenie Caribbean cask to me
as a bourbon drinker.
as a bourbon
Yeah,
drinker to
yeah.
transition me into single malt.
All right.
And I fell in love with it, and it to this day remains my favorite. That's as much as I'm going to talk about the
I
Balvenie
don't-
now, but I love a good.
The Balvenie, that's the 14-year-old, is it?
The 14,
14,
yeah. It's a
It is
beautiful dram.
It is a beautiful.
It is, and so
absolutely.
I'm always excited to try. I'm a fan of the 21 Glenfiddich, which is also a rum cask finish, and this as well. This
And
is
I always say that just to complete that story, and you introduced me to Wild Turkey Rare Breed. So
There you
like
go.
that was great. That
So,
was beautiful moment.
you know.
Yeah.
So this is 43% alcohol. First of all, that's no big deal, and it's just got a lovely. Actually, the mouthfeel of it is really interesting because it's very creamy in comparison to the
is.
original. And it's okay. The sweetness is added to somewhat because the rum
Yeah.
is going to do that too. The sweetness added to, but I think it just and if you like, even compared to the original, you can see how it's changed it, but not dramatically.
No.
It's a lovely sweet, smooth. And I hate when people say smooth, don't you? Because every
Yes.
whiskey
it's
is
the
smooth.
we avoid the word
No,
like
exactly.
apply.
But
Yeah.
I sort of meant on the mouthfeel. It's
Yeah, that
silky,
butteriness,
it's
as you were saying,
silky,
the
exactly,
creaminess. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And it's got a lovely roundedness to it, which I really like. Yeah, it's fruity as well. There's a little bit of the tropical fruit notes that come through in that.
Yep.
And that's again the XO, the rum is helping that.
Yeah, I agree.
little
Like it's
pineapple.
the rum is so. I mean, I don't know if I can even taste rum per se.
No,
it's just,
no.
It's just like you said, the creaminess, the kind of different mouthfeel that you
you're-
get on this is
and I
right
think
on.
it's one of the things. I hope this doesn't insult anybody, but it's one of the things I'm always concerned about is that I do hear people talking about red wine cask. I can taste the red wine, or even a sherry cask can taste the sherry. And we've done some experiments in the laboratory and found out that in order to taste the actual sherry, you're going to have to put about 25% of the liquid has to be sherry.
Right.
You're not going to taste the sherry, but you're tasting the influence of the
Yeah.
sherry butts.
Like the
Or
dryness,
here
the
you're tasting the
cinnamon.
influence,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Or the dried fruits, exactly. So here you're tasting the influence of the rum rather than the actual rum. you know,
Yes,
which is nice.
how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
You don't want it to overwhelm or overtake the spirit itself. The spirit should be, that's your star.
Absolutely right, Jamie. I frequently say to people, if you leave it for too long and you change the DNA of the whiskey, then it's no longer Tullamore Dew, or the Balvenie or whatever whiskey you happen to be tasting. It's no longer you've got to keep the DNA. You've got to be recognizable and yet interesting. It's got to have. I mean, obviously, the rum cask has had an influence, and it's changed it. As I say, it's changed the mouthfeel, and it's given it a nice fruitiness. I mean, I would even say towards tropical fruit.
Yeah,
without-
absolutely. There's that little sort of demerara on the back end, like that little sort of sugary, like something at the top of like a creme brulee, like that sort of just at the very, very back end there. That's sort of like a creamy but a nice little sugary finish, but without being without being sort of like cloyingly
not
sweet.
cloying at all.
It's
No.
just it's very bright.
But
and
it is,
it's-
yeah, and it's like slightly cooked sugar, and
Yes,
you know that
yeah.
on the back of it,
Yep.
which is really nice, yeah.
Really, really nice.
Yeah, it is very subtle. I mean, some of the dry oak elements I was getting was actually from the original Tullamore Dew, like that, like you said, the slight sherry influences.
Yeah.
That's very
And
nice.
this is just being launched actually in Q1, as we say in the business. But
In
Q1,
biz,
hello.
yeah, Q1.
So January, February, March is the time where we started shipping it to markets, and
That's
it's
great.
coming into the US and Canada before St. Patrick's Day.
That's great.
Did we mention St. Patrick's Day?
Wait,
So this will be at the LCBO, I assume.
Yeah,
This
there
will
Yes,
be-
it will be at the LCBO. Yeah.
And what's the price point on this kind of
So the
market?
price point, I believe, is somewhere around $45.95.
Oh,
somewhere
great.
somewhere around $45.
that's-
I understand understand that's the exact price point.
Yeah.
But it was 45.96. Then I could say I was around. I was nearly right.
No, this is wow. This
That's
is
a-
for that price point.
No, it's very
it's
affordable,
really, yeah.
and it's not overly expensive. It's obviously more expensive than the original, but again, it's an affordable and a very drinkable whiskey. You wouldn't be laying it down for years. You know?
And I think that's like ultimately at the end of the day what you want is a beautiful sort of like drinkable, not too overwhelming. Like if you're, out for St. Patrick's Day or if you're out for a pint or whatever, this is a great little sort of dram just to have on hand and you can just enjoy it and not think about it too much and just be like, oh, that's lovely. And then
that's right.
do your thing.
Yeah.
And you'd set out for a pint, which is interesting because we have this thing that we do now called Dew in a Brew. Now, it's really handy because Dew in a Brew, it rhymes.
It rhymes so well. Yeah.
It's like we invented beer for this. But so the Dew in a Brew program that we talk about is the very thing of matching beers and whiskies together. And so why would you do that? Like, why in the name of God would you have a beer and a whiskey together? Well, in fact, my dad, when I was growing up and I went out playing golf with my dad or whatever, if he was afterwards, he would never have a whiskey on its own. He'd never have a bottle of Guinness. He used to drink a bottle of Guinness. He'd never have it on its own. He always had the two together. I never understood it. I thought he was a bit crazy, to be honest, for many reasons. And it turned out he was right for many reasons and in many things in life. And so I like to have a Dew and a Brew myself at the stage, a beer and a whiskey. But there's the other reason is that if you think about it, the raw materials that are used in terms of making, like we make whiskey, we're making beer. We're having a mash of barley and water, and we're fermenting it. Okay, we're not adding hops. So we're taking, but even in the distilleries, we'll have the brewery area of the distillery, or the brew house, So it's, and therefore matching in terms of malt cousins.
Yeah.
A better one than that. Barley Brothers.
Oh,
seriously.
boy. Wow.
I like that
Marketing
one.
must have picked that one up
Oh
right
my
away.
God, yeah. But you know what I mean, and then you should stop me talking here. But then there's the story of the Boilermaker, which not everybody knows. By
Yeah.
the way. And
Okay.
maybe-
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
So when the Irish guys left Ireland for there's no work, and they went to the States to get work until back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, etc. When they would work on things like the railways, or in some cases wearing Boilermaker suits because they were actually making boilers or whatever. So they wore these suits that became known as Boilermaker suits. And when they would go to the bars and order a whiskey and a beer together, so the locals would say, "I'll have what the Boilermaker is having," and that's how it became known as a Boilermaker.
Oh,
Yeah,
see?
yeah. So I sometimes think everybody knows these things. But I decided to tell you because
I've never
because
heard of
people
that.
often say, well, a Boilermaker, where did it get? And that's how it got its name. Yeah. So again, the Irish invented the Boilermaker.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, another
Wow.
invention.
Oh,
Well,
boy.
between that and math, no, that was not. That's amazing. That's really cool. Yeah. And so beer. So would you do you have a couple of quick pairing notes with these? Because I would
Yeah,
say
just-
like I would say the XO would be like a sour beer. I'm gonna go with sour.
Yeah.
Really?
No, and do you know why Mark might be right for the first time in his
Might be.
life?
What?
No, do you know how he might be right?
I
very
would
excited
argue
by-
with, I would
I'm
argue with
very
that, but
excited
I
by
want to
this.
hear.
So the reason I would think you're probably right is that the balance of a sour beer against quite a sweet whiskey actually works really well. So some people ask me about that, and when you're matching your Tullamore Dews with beers, how do you decide? I said, well, if my original, I'm going to pick something like a Pilsner or a lager or something, because there's one is not competing with the other. The two of them are very approachable beers. It's not overly bitter, the beer, and the whiskey is not overly sweet, but they balance nicely, and there's no winner here. There's no one that's killing off the other. Whereas if I'm going for a single malt, I might actually go for an IPA. Okay, so an IPA with a single malt, because you're going to have fruit, and you're going to have fruit. Again, nothing is trying to kill off the other. And here, I like Mark's idea of a sour beer, because I actually don't drink sour beer myself. But a sour beer balancing against that sweet whiskey, I think would be good. Again, no winner.
A lot of changes are coming up. Like we mentioned, 20, 30 distilleries are opening up. What do you expect in the future? Yeah.
So, because of the Irish whiskey industry is growing very fast, a lot of people are getting into it for the first time, which is great. I mean, obviously, I'm a long time around, but it's great to see new energy coming into the industry, new investment. I suppose the one thing I'd be saying to everybody who's getting into the Irish whiskey industry is, this is not short term. This is not a quick buck.
Yeah.
You're going to make that spirit. You're going to lay it down in dark aromatic warehouses for years, and the angels are going to steal some of it. And at the end, you're going to love, your passion is going to shine through, and you're going to have a lovely whiskey in a bottle. And then you've got to get people to drink it. And then you have to spend even more money to get it out there and market it, for want of a horrible term. But, you know, as I often say, if you don't get enough people to drink it, you won't put your 4 expensive kids through college, which I had to do. So you do need it to make money in the end. But we need, as an industry, we need to be patient. We need to be patient, of course, but we need to recognize this is a long-term play. And that's what I hope all of the guys getting into the business will think long-term, because that's very important. And yes, thank God, people are drinking more Irish whiskey than ever. And thank God it's taking its place among the great whiskies of the world. It's still only 9 million cases.
Yeah.
Scotch whiskey is 95 million cases.
Yeah.
Scotland has how many podcasts? 107?
Yeah.
There's 107 distilleries in Scotland. Congrats, you guys. Well done.
We didn't even try.
So, I think the last time I checked, I didn't count them all, but I mean, I think it's about 107 distilleries in Scotland for 95 million cases. We're going to have 30 plus distilleries in Ireland for 9 million cases, which we expect to go to 18 million cases or 20 million cases before too long. But that's quite a fast growth rate. And as long as that continues, or whatever, but we'll still have quite a lot of distilleries. And that's why I say we all need to be a bit patient and be, you know, be long-term investors in this business and be long-term passionates for this business.
I mean, it would think too, like you have almost a new category. There'd be a good opportunity for diversity in that kind of grains used, that kind of thing. Because you speak to like historians, they're saying, well, like oats are underused in Irish whiskey. There's a lot of opportunity to introduce new things that it's too late to introduce in Scotland, can't do it in America without like having like small distillers do it, but like on a larger scale. Like it's a great opportunity to kind of redefine what Irish whiskey is to a consumer base that's going to be introduced to a lot of different distilleries.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And I suppose there's the balance of innovation against maybe experimentation or trying to do something that's so totally new that it's not really traditional Irish whiskey. So what we want to keep our DNA as a category, obviously, and the innovation with new distilleries gives us great opportunities, including for Tullamore Dew. Obviously, great opportunities.
It does. I wonder what the comparison is going to be between like kind of American bourbon country and like Kentucky versus non-Kentucky bourbons, and then in Ireland, right? Because I mean, you had like the small distilleries in the U.S. made bourbon that's tasted different than Kentucky bourbon. They use different grains. The single malts in the U.S. are primarily done by micro distilleries. They're not done by Jim Beam. They might be now, but they weren't originally.
We don't know what's in their thing.
And so this is an interesting this is a good point. And so some of those micro distilleries got a really bad reputation because there wasn't a very familiar flavor, and so how does that change the industry?
Yeah, and I think we all the time want to encourage innovation and experimentation, as long as there's some guidelines and rules there that keep everybody in the fold. And if people, so for example, you're not allowed to add any flavour to your spirit in Ireland if you want to call it whiskey, and that's fine. As long as people don't try and make something imply it's whiskey when it's not whiskey. I'm a bit of an old traditionalist, I know, but I think it is valid to have some guidelines and boundaries and rules, and then within those, experiment away and offer some great variants of whiskey brands, and many of the whiskey companies like ourselves are doing some really interesting things, and as long as we always keep it within the rules, I'm very happy with that.
Which is great, because when you think about it, we have these old distilleries that have sort of they know what they're doing. They've got this incredible history behind them, so they're already making good whiskey, and so generally the experiments are going to be great and somewhat successful. And so I think people get really scared when they're like, oh, these new distilleries are opening up and they're experimenting with this and that, but they don't have the history behind them to be able to say, we've already nailed this thing, but we're going to try this. So there's this we talk about this a lot with innovation, experimentation, and the word craft and handcrafted. What does it mean to be a big distillery, but also considered handcrafted and being able to experiment? It's not just the new guys that get to experiment. It's also super well-established distilleries that can play around because we sort of have the ability to do that. And
maybe have more liquid to play around with.
Exactly.
And that's where we're very lucky. I mean, we consider ourselves very lucky that we're one of the bigger brands. And we were so I haven't been involved in your craft discussions. It's always a debatable point.
Always.
You say something, what does craft mean? To say, if you're small, you're craft. You might not be good.
Yeah.
Therefore, small is not necessarily the best thing. But we, like, in our distillery, like our new distillery in Tullamore, one of the things I would say to people, they come and look and say, wow, it's brand spanking clean. Even my boss used to say, could we not dirty up the stills a bit and whatever? No, these are absolutely polished, beautiful copper stills. But the one thing I would say about our distillery, why I would describe it as craft, is in terms of our carbon footprint, it is really low. Because we have, first of all, the way the distillery is built, we're using much less energy to get from the milling to the mashing to the fermentation to the distilling. It's all on the one floor. Right. Okay. The second thing is that within our system, so the distillery's been built. It's a modern day distillery. Okay, and it's been built by people who know how to build distilleries. And the guys in William Grant's have said to me, if we build a distillery in Scotland soon, it will be built using the Tullamore template as the model. Wow. Because amongst other things we're doing in Tullamore is we have a system called TVR, which is thermal vapor recompression, whereby we're using the heat, the latent heat that's built up in the process, and from the condensers we're reusing the steam to charge up the stills.
Wow.
So that saves us.
Yeah.
The distillery is 17% more efficient than it would have been in the olden days, let's say, and with the TVRs, it's another 14% more efficient. In terms so our carbon footprint is so low. And this day and age, for me, that's what we should be aiming at in terms of distilleries. Okay, it's easy for me to say that because we do it. Yeah. But I'm just thinking for all distilleries, if we can say, amongst other things, that we're being as environmentally friendly as we possibly can be, then I think that's a craft. That's an element of craft that I'm very proud of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I did actually want to tell you a story.
Oh, all right.
Please do.
Before we finish.
Because
people say, so in your career in Tullamore Dew and Irish whiskey, so what was been interesting, and one of the things that's been interesting is that in the 70s, I was a junior boy, okay, and recording, and then I was working in the sales department and the merchandising and building displays, so back in the 70s, when even then, they were building displays. And then I got into the marketing department. I was a brand manager, woohoo, swanky. And then I was offered a job to manage the business Australia, New Zealand, and Asia.
A lot of travel there. That's great.
Well, I was 25, seriously.
Wow.
WTF. I mean, how can you get such a good job when you're 25? I was very lucky. Obviously, I was very lucky. So one of my stories is that I traveled to Japan with my boss, who was kind of handing me over to the whatever. And we were out in a bar in Japan, in a place called Roppongi, and in Tokyo. And the bars over there, they're bottle keep bars. Do you know what they are? They're when you go in, you buy your bottle and they keep your name on it, etc. Yeah. So we went in and we sat down, and the bottle of whiskey that Tullamore Dew was brought to the table, and we were sitting down with some Japanese businessmen, and it was all very nice and sedate and really lovely bar, lovely place. And then some gentleman came. This won't be a long story, I promise. Some gentleman came and sat at his table beside us, Japanese gentleman, and they ordered a bottle of Chivas, and that was brought down and put on the table beside them. And then we were sitting there, and the next thing, my boss jumped up, ran over to the table, grabbed their bottle of Chivas, and ran up the stairs and out the door onto the street. I nearly died. I thought, what in the name of God has he done? And everybody looked at me, and I said, don't look at me. I don't know what he's doing here. So eventually, like a minute or two later, one of the people from the other table sort of said, maybe I need to go after this guy. So, because everybody was a bit, what do we do here? Up the stairs, after, my colleague's name was Reggie. After Reggie, onto the street, grabbed him, obviously. Something happened. The two of them arrived back in, arm in arm. Reggie carrying the bottle of Chivas, and the Japanese man carrying a Tullamore Dew crock. So there was one out in the car outside, and Reggie got it, and we sat down and we shared the whiskies, and when we laughed and we hugged and everything, and everybody was hilariously funny. And I said to him, what was that all about? Yeah. And he said, you know what? They're not talking about us. They're not talking about us. We need to get people talking about Irish whiskey.
So you just steal the
my
whiskey.
God, they talked about us after that. You can imagine what those people told their friends. And it gets to bring us back to today. People are talking about Irish whiskey. We're talking about it. And that's the wonderful thing. For me, that's the wonderful change. From back then, we had to work hard. Okay, we're talking the 80s, but We had to work really hard to get people to talk about us.
Yeah.
Now, okay, social media, communications, all different, etc. But now people are talking about Irish whiskey, and I just think that's one of the great things.
Yeah.
I've told that story before, but it's been a long time.
That's an awesome story.
That's an
I love
awesome
it.
story.
I'm gonna,
Yeah, but it was just kind of
kinda
like,
love that.
if we're talking about you, let's talk about us. That was the sense of it. So.
yeah. Oh, that's wonderful.
Anyway.
It's
Yeah.
like it's like guerrilla marketing before it even existed.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah, it was like the original guerrilla marketing.
Now, had there been social media, that would have been all over social media.
Absolutely.
man.
It would have gone viral.
I know.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
That's
yeah, yeah.
awesome.
amazing.
That's awesome. Well, John, thank you so much for being with us
That's
today.
great, Jamie.
John,
Thank
we have to
you,
be
Mark.
back because I feel like we've only
You just scratched the
Yeah.
surface, I
I
think.
know,
Yeah,
but you
there's
have to be
lots
very
talk
careful
about.
because I talk for Ireland, so you have to be very careful.
I think what we should do is we should send John a clip of a podcast and have him go off on whatever 30-second clip, and then what are John's opinions? 30-second clip.
I think that's great.
And then he will
Shoot off in tangents, you know.
Yes.
Love it.
Wonderful.
love it.
Where can people find you? Are you on the social media? You've mentioned a lot of social media.
Oh
Are
yeah,
you,
no.
are you active?
Unfortunately, I am. Not unfortunately, no. I'm not great at it, but I'm on Twitter. I'm on FaceTube. Oh, no, I'm on Facebook and Instagram now. Yeah.
How can people find you on those?
So at Tullamore Dew JQ is where you'll find me on
John
Twitter.
Quinn, yep.
John Quinn, Global Ambassador, Tullamore Dew on Facebook. And the next one is really embarrassingly, it's John_Quinn_Tullamore_Dew on Instagram. I know, it's terrible. But so people told me I should be on Instagram. And I said, why? I'm on Facebook. And they said, no, you have to be on Instagram. Everybody's talking about Instagram. So then I got one of the guys, and this is embarrassing, one of the guys in IT to put me on Instagram. And he gave me this handle. And actually, I wasn't on it for a while. And actually, I went looking for myself. I said, I can't even remember what I'm called. So that's it. It's John_Quinn_Tullamore_Dew. I know, it's unbelievable.
Wow, that was a very polite. Don't ask me to do this again. Sort of
That's
thing.
great. I'm going to tag you in a picture, and you can find them through me.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
please,
right,
God.
and please, and I mean, also, you travel around the world, so
Yeah.
literally, if you follow John, and if he's somewhere where you are, just ask
go
to meet him
find
in a
him.
bar, and he might pour you cast strength, something
Yeah.
or other.
You never know. Brand
Yeah.
ambassadors, we have fun things in our bags sometimes.
All
You
the
never know
time.
what you have.
That's
in your
Jamie's
purse.
line. There's always something fun in a
There's
purse.
always something
Yeah.
fun in my purse. So.
I'm going to get a purse.
Yeah. That's right. Mark, where can we find you on the social medias?
MERKBYLOK on Instagram and Twitter.
So easy. And you can find me at Bourbon Thing.
All right, thank you guys, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie.
Cheers.
When I say 1, 2, you say 3, 4, 1, 2.